Hi, everybody. Can I get your attention, please? So it's great to see all of you again. Thanks very much for having me back. I really enjoyed speaking with you last week, and I'm looking forward to sharing some more ideas, building on some of the same concepts. But today, talking about self-awareness. Before we go into that, just want to get a show of hands. Who found yes or last week's talk helpful or useful or um, lovely? Okay, that's wonderful news. So hopefully you will find this one as engaging. We are going to go a little bit deeper into some of the concepts here. And so we only do have the 50 minutes. There is a lot here, but I think that by the end of it, there will be a very compelling argument for being true to yourself, as it were. So with that said, I know that you guys have a shortage of math every day, but we are going to start with a very brief warm-up exercise. Now, most of what we're doing is not going to be math related, so don't worry. But if you could just do this in your head or write it down, something like that, that would be helpful. You'll all have different answers, and that's perfectly fine. We good? Okay. So the goal for today is we're going to explore self-awareness. What does it mean to know yourself and know yourselves, which we'll be more specific about in the next little while. Goal number 2 for today is exploring contextual awareness. What does it mean to know other people? What does it mean to know, the inanimate world around us? As a reminder, the idea of sentience is that we observe and understand the world subjectively, right? That we have the capacity for pleasure, pain, and suffering, and that at least should have some bearing on how it is that we behave. We're not just robots. I spoke last time about this idea of there being three sort of perspectives as we zoom out. This idea that we are sentient, right? That we have that we interpret the world around us after we sense our context and ourselves, and then we ultimately decide what we want to do and we act. We're effectively feedback loops. This idea that we are in fact processes. Each of us is, as well as inanimate objects. We're a bit more interesting, I think, because we're not deterministic. You can't exactly tell how someone will react when, or two different people will react when you give them the very same information. And lastly, the idea that we're a network, that we're connected, and through how we influence one another, we grow, we can change our world, so on and so forth. Today, we're going to focus primarily on the first two because those are the ones that um, have a greater significance on our self, right? Which is the focus of today. And the network piece, the empathy piece, that can be another topic for another time. So this was the larger body of work that I had put together over a long period of time. And the idea was really breaking out those three different perspectives and what it meant to be sentient, what it meant to look at ourselves as processes, what it meant to be connected, and how we then use that to govern our behaviors and our actions in a way that we're ultimately happier long term. And the other people around us who we care about are ultimately happier and more fulfilled long term. So what I'm going to start with is really this top third, right? Turn that on. It's really this top third right here. And then we're going to dive into the second portion. So we are feedback loops with judgment. I mean, you have seen that, and by judgment, I mean subjective judgment, right? How we emotionally react to everything, it is baked into how it is we see our world. If I go into a little bit more depth, and we're not going to go into too much depth here because I do want to leave time for the second piece, which is a bit heavier. This idea that there is our self, right? And there's some very specific definitions we will cover in a little bit here, but broken up at least thoughtfully into body, mind, and soul. Now, I'm not advocating for anything paranormal here or phenomenal. Like I'm talking about things that are absolutely supported by science, and these are frameworks and ways of thinking of things, and we'll talk about specific definitions in a moment here. But these are useful constructs in terms of thinking about the different parts of ourselves that are relevant to the questions and answers and decisions that we have in our lives. Then there's also context, this idea that other people, right, that are outside of ourselves, or the world around us, tables, chairs, that kind of thing, the tools that we use, as well as what how does our location influence us? Weather, buildings, that kind of thing, stairs, accessibility, so on and so forth, as well as how does culture affect us? What trends or what behaviors or what biases do we tend to have in different like global cultures, subcultures, so on and so forth. The key thing really to get away from this slide, though, is that we influence one another, right? As individuals, we influence our world, the world influences us. And that's something that maybe not a lot of us have really come to understand until our adult lives or until we're adults. But how many kids know that when they poke the world pokes back, that they can actually change what they see in front of them, that everything that we've seen, that we've built, has been somebody taking the initiative. So I hope in some way that's, an empowering thought. We interpret, right, our world using emotion, and we interpret our world using reason. Now, there are a variety of different emotional models. The one that I subscribe to is Dr. Robert Plutchik's psychoevolutionary theory of emotion, which is this one. It's particularly practical. Now, there are a bunch of different fields of reason as well. Many of you would be quite well versed in these, right? And each of these are obviously entire fields unto their own. And then we ultimately respond, how it is that we decide what we're going to do and then ultimately act. So when we are making our decisions, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are many ways we can make those decisions. We can just make the decisions, we can avoid making a decision. We can delegate it to someone else. We can direct someone, say, hey, this is what I'd like you to do. We can consult, hey, what do you think I should do? Right? We can vote, okay, majority rules, or we can try to reach a consensus, right? We're going to talk this out until everyone is on the same page. Everyone believes we should do the same thing. There are also different things to consider when making the decisions. What do we care about? What do individuals care about? What kind of resources are we dealing with, right? As you might expect. And of course, risk and uncertainty, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns that affect, a lot of the assumptions, right, that go into making any sort of decision. So how we sense, interpret, and respond to our world is an important piece of understanding who we are. And we all, do that slightly differently from one another. Who here has, you've all heard of intuition, but who here has heard of flow as a concept? Okay, a few of you. So flow is an interesting mental phenomenon when you strike this balance between something being really difficult and something being really easy, where it's just difficult enough to be engaging, but you know what you're doing, and so you can actually just do quite a bit of it in quick succession. In cases like that, we tend to reach very high levels of productivity, right? And they tend to be in short spurts. It's not a sustainable state that we can really be in. But intuition, it really comes from, is similar to that. We're effectively using our intuition at that point. Intuition is when we feel like we know what we're going to do and we just act. And maybe we can't exactly reason why we believe inside that that is the right decision, but nevertheless, we are somewhat convinced that our intuition says to do this. And so a lot of us will behave in accordance with our intuition at times. That's a useful thing. I would argue that a good time to trust your intuition is when you feel like you've trained your intuition. So if you're in a familiar environment and you've done a lot of these things before, and maybe you need to act quickly in the same environment, but from whatever circumstance, your subconscious mind is actually fairly well trained in knowing what the outcomes are. And so trusting your intuition in that case is probably not such a bad idea, especially if you have to. Where it is a little more dangerous to trust your intuition is when it's a completely new scenario, right? Or there are new assumptions, or there's new information, or you're just not you're not comfortable with all the surroundings and all the different factors involved. In cases like that, slowing down, applying rational thought, understanding how you feel about it, how other people feel about it, those are useful sort of cautionary steps. But intuition is useful. Just knowing when and when not to trust it is an important piece. Interestingly enough, intuition and flow in particular, they tend to bypass the sense of self So when we are in that state of flow, when we're using our intuition, we tend not to really reference ourselves, right? All we tend to do is we tend to make observations about the context, observations around what's around us, and then we skip immediately to decision and action. It tends to skip rational thought. So it makes it very efficient, makes it extremely productive, and when you can trust it, you know, that's a great tool. We then operate in these two dimensions, right? Or four, if you want to think of space as three dimensions, but effectively these two dimensions, time and space. There's a lot of different ways to look at this. We talked about one being time as a universal currency, and that's useful. But another way to look at it is, how do we communicate about time? Well, we tend to communicate time in absolutes, so a specific time, a relative time, I'll be there in an hour, a target time, we'll see you on the 23rd, right? Or scale as well, so hours, days, years, millennia, right? We tend to talk about time in that particular dimension in four different respects or ways. And space is actually fairly similar, at least in its categories. So we tend to be specific with the with locations, so absolute. Now, recognizing we do have coordinates and the like. If we all accept those same coordinates, then we can talk about an absolute location. We can talk about relative location. I'm a kilometer away. We can talk about target. I will see you at the restaurant, right? Or scale as well. So if we're talking about centimeters, millimeters, nanometers, kilometers, light years, right? Those are different ways that we tend to communicate our dimensions, and it's useful to recognize, I guess, how it is we communicate those. But the one other way that I would think about these dimensions too is that time is our universal currency. We spend it, and it can buy anything that money can and more. Time is extremely important to us, as I think many of you know, and you'll gradually become more and more, I guess, convinced of that as you get older and you have less of it. But then space, you can think of that as, philosophically, you can think of that as the marketplace. The marketplace where we spend and trade and buy and sell what we value using the currency of time, right? So when you're thinking about what it is that you care about, what other people care about, that's ultimately what you're doing, is how do you deliver that to somebody in a particular marketplace, which is effectively space. So I realize that's fairly high level, but we are going to go a little bit deeper, specifically around the processes. So we process and influence our world, right? Not a lot of people necessarily think of us processing what's around us. We think about thinking. There's a few examples of that. But how we actually influence our world is kind of up to us, and not a lot of people, I think, are reminded or taught at an early age. I certainly wasn't, that we can change what's around us, and that what's around us is not necessarily a given. So having a process background myself, again, operations research, tried to think of what was a good visual way to represent a process in a generalized way that could really represent any process. And I came down to this particular graphic because it had all 9 components of any process. The process components are the boundaries, so what is part of the process and what is not, right? The inputs, what does that process take in as an input? The inventory, so what inventory is currently being worked on by the process? What outputs does the process then have? What's the purpose of the process? Why does it exist in the first place? What's the underlying mechanism or the operation that does any of the transformation or the work? What biases does the process have? So does it tend to bring in more inputs or of a particular kind, or produce more outputs of a particular kind? And so you'll start to see where this is going, but asking what it is that is our purpose, right, is one of those lifelong questions or age-old questions, right? Recognizing our biases, not necessarily a bad thing, it's just inherent to who we are and what it is that we value. That's also a useful thing to recognize. Performance. How do you measure the performance of a process? How do you measure how well you are doing, right? How well do you measure what other people are doing? What key performance indicators, what measurements matter? Because there are thousands of them. Which ones do you pick? Which ones are relevant? And then our state as well, right? Which is really this concept that actually comes from physics, obviously, around our state being our position and our momentum. Well, we are currently here and we are on our way there, right? And that alone is necessary to, or those things alone are necessary to determine our state. So let's dive into how that gets applied. So specifically, let's talk about boundary first. Now, recognize the text is a little bit small. I will make these things available later. But there are two sections here, really, or there's around self and context. We're going to touch on self first, always, but I'm showing context here too, because it takes a very parallel structure, and I think it's a useful one um, to understand how it is that we can interact with our world and ultimately be happier. So the interesting thing about the boundary is, let me, I guess, ask you a question. How many people would define the boundary of themselves as their skin, as a first pass assumption, right? And I did too. So, and then I heard this really funny question. If you weigh 99 pounds and you eat a pound of pizza, are you 1% pizza? Right? And I don't know about you, but my answer was no, I'm not 1% pizza. So it ultimately came to this conclusion that, you know, that some of the resources we use, whether internal or external, whatever, that those aren't yet a part of us. And really what is us is this network of cells. The cells are what have your DNA, that is you, right? Everything else that is sort of around those are resources that are currently, say, within this geographical, or within this space, but they're not us. And so there's value in that interpretation, and we'll get to sort of why in a bit. Knowledge works much the same way, or the boundary of the mind. We can think of our mind as being the extent of our knowledge, right? It's the network of memories that we have. And I don't mean memories strictly in the past sense, but if you have new ideas, if you create something new, right? While that is new, as soon as you think of it, you commit it to memory. So even for future-oriented thoughts, go into memory right away, if that makes sense. And of course, if you're anything like me, you're somewhat forgetful, you'll start to lose memories as well. Okay. And then the soul. So this one I thought was by far the most interesting. A really practical definition I found for the soul is the social network you have with yourself at different points in time. Now, bear with me. It seems like an odd definition, but it does a couple of things. First of all, you can think about who you were at 5 years old. You can think about who you were at 25, who you want to be at 75, who you think you'll be at 53. Imagine yourself in this lecture hall with 100 other yous from ages 1 through 100, assuming that's your life expectancy. I mean, I hope you all live longer than that. But what if you could put to a vote, the questions that you have on your mind today to the rest of yourselves? Would that be a useful group of people to ask? Some of the other reasons that this ends up being consistent with different belief systems is, while this is not grounded in any sort of theology or religion, it happens to be compatible with many, I hope all religions. Some religions believe that you exist beyond, your physical form here. It doesn't happen to be my belief, and it doesn't really matter what my belief is, but that's partly why this definition of soul works so nicely too, is because when you feel like you're going to be in eternity somewhere, right? Whether it's resurrection, whether it's heaven, hell, that kind of thing. that when you're there for eternity, that has a disproportionate effect on the vote. And so it guides your behaviors today. So whether you believe that there's a life after death, so on and so forth, either way, this ends up being a fairly practical way to think about the soul. It's really this network of cells, the social network of selves that we have, and what it is that we valued at those times. Now, the one that I think you're probably most familiar with is, we have obviously our social internet or internetwork, right? The people that we get to know, right? Intra-network is really the soul. And then we have our resource network, right? So water bottles, money, cars, tools, flowers, right? So the way that I would argue thinking about the boundary of us as well as different parts of us is really the network of cells that represent our selves. Inputs. So here it makes no shouldn't be any surprise that like the body takes matter and energy in as an input. Um, our mind takes information, right? Ultimately integrates that and compares it with our existing knowledge and adds to it. The our self-awareness is really this practice of, well, who am I today, but trying to remember who I was 5 years ago. Who do I want to be 5 years from now? This is where practices like journaling and self-reflection and all that, where this is actually really practical. What you're ultimately doing is you are getting to know all those other 100 people in the room better, so that when you do that thought experiment of ultimately asking all of your different selves what the right path is, um, you're likely to get a better answer because you know those people better. Um, right. With other people, obviously, getting to know what other people care about, empathy is a huge piece. And then, as far as resources are concerned, it's the inputs is revenue, and I don't mean that just strictly in financial terms, but if somebody gives you a pair of socks, like, I mean, effectively that's still revenue as well. Inventory. So we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the boundary, but our cells are effectively what our body's inventory is. Our memories is what our mind's inventory is. Our self images, right? So this image we have of our 5-year-old self, our 53-year-old self, that can be considered the inventory of our soul, right? This network of social that we have with ourselves. And I realize this is fairly high level, but when you actually practice it, you get remarkably good answers out of it. Contacts. So, right, any social network, right? You have different contacts, obviously meeting people in real life as well. and then um, and then also what resources do we happen to have at the moment? And I don't just mean what resources you actually own, but also resources that you can influence or control. Outputs are similar. There's a slight difference. So we still output matter and energy, which shouldn't be too surprising. A lot of that, though, is, and I guess the common thread across all of these is that all of our networks, right? The networks of selves that we have, the networks of cells, the network of memories, right? Our knowledge, the social network we have with each other, the resources that we happen to have, all of those degrade, they erode with time, and they need to be renewed, which we'll see in a bit. Um, but information, right? So we have information output in two ways. A, we forget a lot of things, and B, we share information, right? We tell other people, we communicate. Um, our soul is similar. The idea that when we get to know our 5-year-old self well, and we get to know our 7-year-old self well, we get to know our 6-year-old self almost better as a result, right? So self-awareness begets self-awareness, but then also we can start to forget who we were. How many people remember daily life when they were 4 years old? Right? We don't. And to a degree, that's somewhat unfortunate. What about 8 years old? What about 12? What about 18? I mean, some of you might actually be 18, so, but for me, that was a while ago. I guess where I'm going with that, though, is it's so easy to forget who we were, and it's easy to not think about who we are going to be or who we want to be. So you can imagine the power of trying to remember on a regular basis who we were, to write some of that down, to write down who we want to be, who we think will be, and how useful would that set of people be in asking questions that are you're involved in today. One second. Okay. And same thing with other people. We lose touch of friends, right? We fall out of favor with friends, and we have our costs, right? We regularly spend our resources, time, money, otherwise, on experiences or other things, or um, yeah, it gets different outcomes. So, what's our purpose? Like, that seems like it's the question, right? I mean, who here has legitimately asked themselves what's the purpose of life, right? Like, this is one of the age-old ones, and I know this feels fairly high level, but it's self-consistent, I guess, the work, and so that has helped, I guess, come to some of these conclusions, and they're pretty feel-good conclusions, but they're also ones that give you the responsibility of doing something about it. So if we look at our body specifically within self, what is the purpose of our body? Well, our body does a number of things, right? It travels through time by just surviving, right? It travels through space by moving, and then it interacts with things, right? It causes influence. When we talk about our mind, what does our mind actually do? Um, well, our mind controls our behaviors, right? And so the better our mind does that, right, the more we're able to trust ourselves to engage in the behaviors that we want to do. Well, which behaviors do we want to do? Well, that comes down to our soul. If you asked 100 people, 100 versions of yourself in this room, what should I do today? Right? The overwhelming majority of them are going to give you an answer. And that answer um, is what would collectively make all of yourselves happier, right? Almost on a net present basis. And so life is really about enjoying ourselves, but you can imagine that while enjoying yourself in the moment, if you sacrifice the enjoyment of your 65-year-old self, so on and so forth, that you start losing that vote, right? And so it helps to behave in ways that are effective long term, but at the same time, maximizing how happy the 65-year-old self is by working 30 years, right, at something that you detest, that doesn't win the vote either. Does that make sense? And so we talked about just this emotional model, the idea of combining joy and trust really being love. And so if enjoying yourself is what your soul is meant to do, and trusting yourself is what your mind is meant to do, and your body is basically the mechanism with which you go do it, right? Then the purpose of yourself is to love yourself. It's to enjoy what you're doing and to trust that you'll do it long term. Now, interesting, when you look at that collectively, it's very similar. It's to enjoy each other, to create joy in other people's lives, to show other people that we can trust them, to earn other people's trust, to seek trustworthy people in our lives. Um, and I know this sounds very airy fairy, but it you can apply math to it, right? It is, how happy ultimately are we as a society? How fulfilled are we? And you judge that by the general population, and you always try to improve it, right? There's no perfect here. It's always just better, better, better. And then lastly, from an inanimate object standpoint, it comes down to um, form and function. Who has heard of the I guess that expression form and function before? What's effectively, right, this. Form is it beautiful to us, right? Does it evoke an emotional response to us? Just by looking at it. Does it, or is it useful, or a combination of the two, right? If it's useful, then we can then use it to gain experiences or help other people that long term make others happy. It doesn't do so directly, but it's nevertheless, well, useful. So what are some of the underlying mechanisms? The the common thread across here is that different parts of our cells are ultimately these networks, right? Network of cells, network of memories, network of cells, network of other people, network of resources. What happens on a regular basis is that all of these networks refresh, they renew, right? Our bodies are continuously renewing ourselves. Different cells reproduce and replace each other at different rates, but I think on average you are physically an entirely different person every 7 years, something like that. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but um, it's an interesting one. Same thing with our memories, right? We refresh our memory by seeing some of the same things again, or we gain new memories, we lose other memories. Effectively, it's always renewing, and we're trying to connect it to other memories too. Same thing with our soul, right? You've got 100 people in here, you only know each so well. Some people, some of yourselves, different versions of yourself, you will stop remembering as well, right? It's easy to remember who you were yesterday, but give yourself 5 years, it'll be hard to remember that same day, right? Unless you do journaling, unless you write some of this down, unless you write down what you cared about at the time, so that when you're lost 5, 10 years down the road, you can reflect back on who you were in maybe a more innocent state or in a more curious state. And that can be really, really empowering 5 to 10 years down the road. So I mean, these are practices that people advocate for, but that's the reason why, is that you have a better sense of who you are, and you can ask effectively those people what you should do. You seek your own guidance. Um, and then same thing with other people, right? We renew our connections, right? We fall out of favor with some friends, we gain new friends, friendships strengthen, right? We have acquaintances, of course, as well. Um, and then the other thing is resources. So the interesting thing about resources, and I make this distinction between sentience and non-sentience here. Um, so this makes the assumption, without drawing the line at a particular point, but this idea that if certain living beings are not capable of uh, of pleasure or pain, right? Like plants, right? Then we can start looking at them as resources. Of course, there's the inanimate, non-living things as well, but I've lumped them together. That's a conversation unto itself. But something interesting is that all the living things, including ourselves, by the way, we tend to decrease entropy. We tend to create order out of things, right? Like uh, if it weren't for a lot of biological processes, all of our atoms and molecules and cells and stuff like that would just dissipate, right? But we're all held together because it's a system. Non-living things tend to increase entropy, increase chaos, increase um, sort of dispersion, right? So I just found that an interesting thing to include. So that's sort of the underlying operation of resources, whether they're living or not, because they aren't um, necessarily aware of some of those connections. So bias. The best way I can describe bias is that it's what we repeat. So muscle memory, for anybody who plays sports, is a relevant example. When your body repeats the same activity time and time again, it gets particularly good at it. And also, if you try to do something similar, it's actually hard to do something similar and not the same because your body is so used to doing it a particular way. Habits, which are more so a product of the mind, right? We have neurological pathways in our brains that get more reinforced when we engage in certain habits more often than others, right? We have bad habits, we have good habits. The best way to replace a bad habit is by replacing it with a good one, but you have to do it enough times until that pathway becomes stronger. But it's effectively what we repeat. And the bias of our soul, right? If you talk about 100 other yous in this room, it's this idea that the more of those people that share what it is that they value, right? It's effectively what your soul is repeating, right? 60 of the 100 yous say they care about this particular thing, right? Those are what your values are. Um, that's why they tend to stay constant over time as well. Culture. So culture is similar. Culture is like it's our values, but at scale, right? When you have a lot of people with similar values, you have a culture, right? And this can be it can be a particular religion, it can be a particular country, it can be a particular uh, activity, right? I mean, there are cultures, you could say, around um, fan bases with sports teams, right? They all share behaviors, right? They all watch particular players, they all have similar knowledge, so on and so forth. And so um, it's a useful way of thinking about our culture. And so when we think about changing culture, really, if we're going to have any influence on it, it's how do we how do we get people, even if it's one or two or three, to start behaving differently because it's in their best interest. And the more people that do it, the more people see that, so on and so forth. And that's how culture evolves: is that you gradually get slower changes in behavior. And then location factors, which I think we talked about before. But what does nature repeat, and what does culture build? So I mean, you have different architecture as an example of the physical world representing culture, right? Or the physical world being influenced by culture. And similarly, you've got different uh, areas of the world that see different climates. And as a result, you see nature, flora, fauna that represent that climate, right? Because of that climate repeating. So, performance, how do you measure how well you're doing, right? Well, the body is ultimately about influencing things. So, how well are you able to influence the world around you? How fast are you? How strong are you? How agile are you? How flexible are you? Some of the normal measurements for the human body. There's hundreds of them, I'm sure. Um, how do you measure uh, I guess, how well your mind is performing? Ultimately, there are a lot of different ways you can measure it too, right? How quickly do you think? How good is your memory? How good is your attention span? How empathetic are you? How emotionally intelligent are you? Um, which all of that leads to you ultimately being able to trust yourself because you've got a high degree of self-discipline. And then how do we measure how well our soul is doing? Well, when you talk about the 100 people in this room, it's this idea that um, you are doing well if you are acting consistently with what that room would like, right? Which might feel good for you at the moment, but it will definitely feel good for most of you for most of the time. And so sometimes, obviously, we make short-term sacrifices so that we can be happier for the rest of our lives, so on and so forth. But it's, and in other cases, we give ourselves the permission to fully enjoy this because we know we won't have the opportunity later. People that travel before they retire because they don't think they'll have the health to travel once they do retire, things like that. And then the performance of different inanimate objects is ultimately subjective, right? What I find beautiful is not necessarily what you might find beautiful, and that's okay. What I find useful is not necessarily what you would find useful. We have different goals, we have different aims, we have different reasons why we would use those tools. So that's entirely subjective. And the last one that I'll touch on before wrapping this up is this idea of what state we're in. So from a physics standpoint, state is position and momentum. If you break down momentum, you have velocity and direction, I think it is. No, sorry, velocity and mass. You can obviously split velocity into speed and direction. So when you look at sort of equivalents for those, first in the physical realm and then the equivalents in sort of the other spaces, you can actually get some interesting insights. So fair enough, we are like physically, I'm in a particular spot. I weigh a certain amount, not as little as I'd like, and I have a particular speed in a particular direction at this point in time. Right, my arm's going this way. I'm walking this way. Free body diagram, all that stuff. Right. Um, and our mind, you can think of the position as what's our current state of knowledge? What do we know right now? And that includes beliefs, by the way, right? And a lot of the knowledge that may not be true, but we think it is true. Belief, by the way, is acting as though something is true. So there's that. But what is our current state of knowledge? Mass is like, well, which of that knowledge are we really applying at the moment, right? How quickly are we applying it? So brainwave frequencies, how much are we really concentrating on any one thing? And what are we focusing on, right? What's our direction? Soul, similar. So how many people in that 100-person room do you feel you know well? How many people's opinions within that room are relevant to the conversation at hand? Maybe you're only asking a few of them because maybe that's all that matters. How strong do they feel about their opinions? And what emotions are they feeling? Are they elated that you're doing something that is going to be in your long-term best interest, or they're a little bit disappointed because you went out when you should have been studying? You know what I mean? So it's helpful to think of our soul really as this 100 people, other people as well, and what is the current state of our social network? Well, how many people are in our network? How many people are we talking to, let's say, in these few days, or are we around right now? Um, all of the above really matter in terms of whether those people, I guess, how well they are able to influence the world, how well they're able to concentrate and apply things mentally, and how they ultimately feel, right? Both now and their respective future selves. And sort of same thing there. And sort of last but not least, when you're talking about regular resources, it is about how many resources are in your network. So I have 6 pairs of socks, right? How many am I wearing? Ideally 1 pair. Hopefully the same on each foot. Resource usage rate. So how quickly am I wearing my socks out? I apologize for the example. and resource allocation. Okay, 1 to each foot as opposed to 2 on one. So I guess where I'm going with that is it's helpful to know where you are, right? As well as where you're going. Sometimes I think you feel like you need to know where you are to know how to get to where you want to go. You kind of need to know both locations. So the long and the short of it is I realize these ideas are fairly complex, but I tried to, I guess, make it as comprehensive as possible. We are infinitely complex. There are so many things you could know about yourself. And I want to ask, before I move on to the next slide, how many people find that idea that we could never fully know ourselves, like fully, and be sure of it, daunting? Especially now that we know that it matters. It matters to know ourselves, but it's fairly convincing we can't. Not fully. But it doesn't stop us from doing better, right? The fact that we can't is what empowers us to figure out what matters and what's relevant. So if we can't know everything, what should we know? Who should we talk to? Is my 5-year-old's opinion or my 5-year-old self's opinion relevant in this particular case, or should I be asking my 60-year-old self? Or maybe a combination of the two, right? You get to decide what's relevant. And then you can be self-aware to the extent that it matters, to the extent that it'll influence your decisions and your actions, because there's a lot of self-awareness, there's a lot that you could pay attention to as well. This is similar to the attention economy thing around you that isn't relevant to you. Don't ever apologize to yourself for not spending time on stuff that doesn't matter. And that includes reflecting on yourself in ways that you're not going to readily apply. Because only when it affects your outcomes and your behaviors and your decisions and your actions is it going to make a world of difference? So when you feel stuck or lost, I forgot to tell you this, we actually have 2 guests in the class. Um, 2 guests in particular will help you find your way. They are you at those 2 different ages that we calculated at the beginning of the class. I want you to think about some of the stuff that you're going through right now, some of the problems, some of the opportunities, some of the ups, some of the downs. And I want you to think about sharing that with your younger self. I think I did the math right, and your older self. And what would those versions of you say? Would they give you words of encouragement? Would they caution you? Would they show you the same love that you would expect of a good friend? So if it is hard at some points to think about 100 versions of you, try to think about 2, a past one and a future one. The past one, for lack of better terms, represents our curiosity, our hunger, right? Wanting to know more, be more, grow up, do more. That hunger, that drive, that youth, that energy, that kind of exudes through the really young people. And then the older one is really about legacy. What do you want to? How do you want to leave the world? How do you want to leave the other people that you knew in this world? And the last thing I guess I'll leave you with before moving this, I guess the 2 last things is, one, this is how you stay true to your soul, right? We hear that expression a lot, but here's a practical way of actually doing it, right? It's, okay, I have a fairly good idea of who I have been so far because I've been writing it in a journal, or I've reflected on it, or I've asked my parents or my grandparents who may remember me at that age better than I remember myself. Certainly, they're more objective, although not unbiased. And as well as your future self, right? Do you want to? What are you doing to plan who you want to be? Who are you deciding you want to be? Right. The interesting thing about who here has been told by some older person to visualize who you want to be, to visualize some outcome, right? One of the reasons I believe that works really well is because then you have a better idea, a better picture of who that 38-year-old self is, right? When you have a better idea of who that 38-year-old self is, you can ask that person a question. And the last thing around legacy, though, is if, and I'm not necessarily saying that our soul continues to exist indefinitely. It may or may not. I have no idea, right? We all have different belief systems around that. But one way that you can live beyond just this mortal coil, as it were, right, is by influencing the people around you, by having a positive impact on the people around you, by having them remember who you were at a given point in time. So I hope that in your way, you're chasing legacy, you're looking for impact, but you get to decide what that is. That power comes with the responsibility of deciding what that is. That's it. Now, this was the first time I've presented this material to a larger group. I've spoken about it with a few people, a few clients already. I did, just so you know, update this version from 2.1 last week to 2.2. I wanted to make sure that it was as self-consistent as possible. And I recognize that there are going to be potentially a lot of questions because there's a lot of new ideas here that frankly took a long time to think through and develop. But I think you'll find that as you put some of them into practice, they work elegantly. May I ask, who here keeps a regular journal or a journal of any kind, or who has in the past? Of those people who have some idea of who they were in the past, How many reflect on it from time to time? Um, and without singling anybody else out or anybody out, who has found reflecting on who they were and their thoughts at the time and found it useful? So I hope that these are there's some evidence in your own life already for why some of this works. I hope that this has been a useful conversation. And at this point in time, I'm happy to answer any questions you have, whether it's generally about some of these ideas or specifically within your own life. Um, but the key takeaways I hope are that while you can't know everything about yourself, you can know the right things, and that's worth doing. Thank you. So, are there any questions that come to mind before we move on? I know you might have other engagements, and that's perfectly fine. Like last time, I'm around to uh, answer any questions you might have or take feedback because I'm always trying to improve some on these ideas as well. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So uh, you've got those 6 steps. There's sensing self, sensing context, interpreting with emotion, interpreting with reason, and then deciding and acting, right? Sensing self, you're at the moment or like when you're applying intuition, you tend not to think about how you're currently feeling. What tends to happen is you notice what's happening and you intuitively come to an answer as to what should be done, right? And you don't necessarily know how you reach that answer, but it doesn't tend to go through um, you and your awareness of yourself in a rational or methodical way, as it would if you were intentionally sitting down and working on a difficult problem. Um, so that's sort of how intuition um, tends to come about, and what the researchers tend to find is that people don't in the moment think about themselves or measure what they're currently doing. They just their mind comes to an answer. You said you had a second question? Or? Okay, great. All right, everyone. Yep. Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. So yeah, there are two ways you could approach your future selves. One could be the set of people you expect to be, let's say given your current trajectory, or you can also be more aspirational, the set of people you would like to be, right? And they have pros and cons depending on the scenario. If you need to make a decision that is particularly risky and maybe you're risk averse, right, you might want to make decisions on the basis of who you expect to be, maybe as a, a lower boundary or something like that in terms of success or financial, you know, wealth or whatever the case might be. Just so you don't overcommit yourself, and then there's always upside, right? If you do better than that, so that's one way to do it. Um, but the thing is, when you look at yourself only as who you expect to be, you're not likely to become who you could be, right? And the opposite is true. If you always look at yourself as how you could be, um, you just because of external factors, right? You might not hit that mark, and you don't want to let yourself down either, right? But there is value in uh, looking at your future selves as who you could be, because then you can ask yourself that question, or that person. You can imagine your 53-year-old self after having had some career success, possibly early retirement, something to that effect, and uh, and ask yourself, well, who is that person? What skill sets would they need to have had to have achieved those results by that time? Um, what, how can you envision your 53-year-old self ideally spending his or her time, right? And then you've got a clearer picture of who that person is, who you currently are, and then which of those differences you approach first, right? In terms of a stepwise prioritization or that kind of thing. So visualizing who you want to be is useful because then it helps you create the action plan. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, but it really depends on how high risk I think the decision you're making is and how risk averse you are, how willing to accept that risk you are. Yeah. Um, Reels? Yep.
I was curious how you go about journaling because when I journal, I tend to just not know what to write down.
So, I mean, there are a lot of different experts on journaling, and I'm not going to pretend to be one. I think the general consensus is that you do you, right? You do whatever comes to mind. Some people will try to journal with very specific topics on a daily basis, reflect very intentionally on what they learned today, what went well today, a balance of good and bad so that they keep their ego in check, but at the same time, they're able to continue growing and have some positive reinforcement and some encouragement on a daily basis. Some people will advocate for that. Other people will advocate for something similar to how authors overcome writer's block. You just write, right? You can always edit later. You just write. Stream of consciousness, no judgment on what it is that you're writing or how high quality it is or how thoughtful it is. You just write. So I think it's a matter of exploring it and trying it and finding out what's best for you. Um, because there's so many different ways to do it. It it I think it is more useful the more you do it. You're only really going to continue doing it if you enjoy it and if you're seeing benefits from it. So it has to be somewhat customized to your personal style. Yep.
You mentioned that like the state of flow, and is there some like any tips or suggestions on how we could achieve a state of flow in our daily lives?
Yep, absolutely. Certain artists use it. A lot of different people who just need to get work done. And I get it. Like sometimes we've got really difficult assignments and just you need to get them all done before the deadline. Um, so it helps to remove distractions, right? Because really, when you're in that state of flow, you're observing exactly what's in front of you. Ideally, it's something that is not too hard, but not too easy, so that you stay mentally engaged, but you don't burn yourself out right in the moment. And it's something that you're familiar enough with that you know how to do. So an example would be like 100 fairly easy math questions, right? Like it's a matter of just working through them. All of you can do them, right? But there's this balance between it being easy and it being difficult. That removing distractions, uh, also clearing your mind, right? So whether you engage in any mindfulness practices, uh, in a formal way, or whether you do it in an informal way, again, whatever works for you, that is often useful. It's try to tie up loose ends and other things that need to be considered before you plan to get into a state of flow, so that you aren't distracted by your own thoughts and unfinished business, right? That maybe you need to do for the rest of the day or something like that. So try to tie a lot of things up if you can, leading into those few hours where you really want to be highly productive. Um, but just by its nature, because it's high productivity, it's also high energy, right? And so it maximizes time, but it's not sustainable because it happens to be high energy. And fair enough, like it's a high work output rate. Right? So those would be my tips, and generally what people advocate for when trying to get into a state of flow. Same thing with artists, right? They give themselves the space and the freedom and the clarity of mind to just create and be that conduit, or however it is you want to look at artistic endeavors. Yep.
I was wondering, what's the relationship between consistency of soul with all of your future and past selves versus, like, I guess, consistency of self? Because I find I'm not the person I was 5 years ago,
Yep.
nor would I want to anymore. I think yeah, I improved in some ways, and maybe I've fallen back in other ways.
Yep.
And I'm definitely not the person I am in the future, and I definitely want to move towards that. But at the same time, you mentioned keeping your consistency of soul and like consistent values throughout this process of changing who you are.
Yes. So I guess the most, because I've thought about it as well, right? I wanted to make sure that these ideas, stood up the test of time, as it were. But the the most disadvantageous scenario, the scenario that I think tends to work least well, is if you can imagine a 65-year-old who has heavy regrets about how they've spent their life. Now they know they're going to live maybe another 10 years or so, but that's it, given their health complications or whatever the case might be. And they decide that they want to do something markedly different and change at 65, right? That does a couple of things. First of all, they're thinking of 75 versions of themselves in the room, 65 of whom are going to have a vote in a particular direction, right? And the way that I believe it works to sort of get around the fact that our past selves can have this overwhelmingly negative vote relative to what we want to do in the future, it's this idea that our past selves didn't have today's information. So really when you're talking to yourselves, it's this idea that, okay, you've got 100 yous, maybe 99 in the audience. Here's present you sitting in the front, right? So look guys, here's the situation I'm in, right? Here's all of the information, right? And yes, I know you were like that, and yes, I know you used to engage in those behaviors, and this is how I currently am. And really what you're doing is you're polling for values. You're not polling for assumptions or ignorance and so on and so forth. Because yes, at 6 years old, there's so much you don't know, right? But in explaining it to your 6-year-old self in a way that a 6-year-old would understand, what would your 6-year-old self like to do, right? And what would your 75-year-old self like to do, given that you've briefed them on the situation, right? That's the way that I've found it helps, because I'd like to think that you've become your current self on the basis of maybe your 14-year-old self, having learned a few things, right? And that when you teach your 14-year-old self a couple of those things, and the 14-year-old self listens to your present self, which may or may not happen because authority figures. But when you do that, the 14-year-old self hopefully would give you a serious answer and be like, well, I really enjoy this kind of work. I think you should do this. Like I would love to do this, or I would envision myself in 10 years from your 14-year-old self. Um, I would love to do that kind of work. And so you're polling for values as opposed to knowledge. You had a question as well?
Yeah, mine was actually going the other way. So when you're looking at the future,
Yep.
how do you like? So obviously, sort of what Thomas mentioned is like your values are going to change over time.
Mm-hmm.
So do you try to predict how your values are going to change in the future, or just base your future self off of your values now?
You predict how they will naturally change. So I wouldn't expect that without a so I mean, different people have midlife crises, and like that aside, because you never know quite when that's going to happen. You don't want to assume that your future self is going to be entirely different from who you currently are, right? Values change slowly. They can change, but they tend not to change entirely. So if you think about your values, remember last time when we talked about values, the reason why we thought about it was so that it changed our behaviors, right? And how it is we ultimately spent our time and how it is that we made decisions. So if you think about your 70-year-old self as being, how would your 7-year-old self like to spend their day? That's an easier thought experiment than necessarily projecting your values to the 70-year-old person. Because how that person would like to spend their day, maybe that is partly involved, like maybe you expect to have grandchildren at that point, or at least there's the possibility of it. Maybe you want to take up golf, or whatever the case might be. Uh, Projecting how you would want to spend your day is a really good proxy for what your 70-year-old self values. Um, so I would think of it that way. And um, much of this other gentleman's point earlier, you can see how you're currently spending your day and how you would want to spend your day, and you can look at it that way too. What do I need to do to spend my days in those ways, right? Or what are some of those things I could just start doing now because hey, I actually care about that, and I've given myself permission to do it. So yeah, think about how you would spend your time would at 70, ideally. Any other questions at the moment? All right, well, thank you very much for your time and attention. It was a pleasure bringing some of these ideas to you. I know they are very different, and it has taken me a long time to reflect on them and start to apply them. I'm my own guinea pig, but I think as you, yeah, think about who you have been, what you have valued in the past, what you are likely to value in the future in terms of how you want to spend your time, that when you ask, when you poll those people, and you pull those future selves and those past selves, that you'll get a clearer idea of what you should do now along with ideally some encouragement. Thank you.
Asking questions as part of the
Oh,
class.
yeah, by all means.
So like when you were talking about the like thinking about yourself and I can like never know yourself.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know like where to stop with that sort of introspection before you just like run into some kind of like existential.
Right. So if you want to know yourself better, right, in order to make a better decision or to plan your time better or something to that effect, you want to start looking for diminishing returns. So it's if you have a decision in front of you and you want to know which way you should make it, um, think about what information up front you would need to make the decision, have that be a fairly finite answer, and then go get it. Once you get it to that degree, stop. Right? Because it can be tempting to just to continue thinking about who we are, so on and so forth. But after you have enough information to know which way you're going to behave, or be fairly confident in which way you're going to behave, you should stop because no further thinking is going to change the behavior, and at that point you start wasting time.
I think that's kind of my question though. Is like philosophically, like how can you say that it's not worth exploring further? And like, because what if that next realization would just be like nothing matters or something? Like, how do you know that like that's not valid?
Right. So if you want to think about polling different people in the future, as an example, let's say you're 20 now and you expect to live to 80, you could start by asking your 50-year-old self and your 80-year-old self. If they give relatively consistent answers, but you're still not entirely sure, you could ask your 30, 40, 50, every 10, and you can get a representative sample that is something that it's increasingly higher resolution. The higher the resolution you get you get over um, a sort of a broader span of your life, the more believable that's going to be, as opposed to it's when you're 71 you change your mind and 79 you changes back, right? Um, so just do sort of like even sampling, as it were, about does it make sense in 10 years as well as 20 as well as 30 years from now. I think that'll give you a pretty good idea fairly quickly about how likely is it true if you were to pull all 60 years from here on out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So just start with lower resolution. It takes less time, and then as soon as you're convinced, stop.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hi.
First of all, thanks for coming. It was really enlightening.
You're welcome. I apologize if it was. It's the first time I presented that material in this way, and so I hope it came across okay.
Oh, it was great.
Yeah.
I have a question about like today's activity,
Yeah.
like forecasting or projecting your values and then like
Yeah.
seeing where they line up.
Yep.
Is that based like do you have to have a sound view of what your values are in order to project? Because I feel like if you don't know what you want, or if you don't know what like,
If you don't know the
matters to
present.
you and you project those, you're gonna move down a really
Yes,
wrong path.
which is part of the reason I think why this lecture, I'd say would have like the first one is almost as a prerequisite in some of the work, right?
Yeah.
It's do you have a good idea of what you want right now, right? Just to start, like today, what would make you happy today? When you're fairly comfortable and confident in that, then I think you're in a better spot to be able to project. But at very good point, like you wouldn't want to ask those questions. You don't want to extrapolate out when there's a lot of uncertainty around your base points, right? From a mathematical point of view. Right?
Right. What would you do if like you want to change, like if you forecast and not like you don't like what you see, but you want to change that? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, there is that switch in strategy about whether you forecast who you expect to be or whether you forecast who you want to be. If you start forecasting who you expect to be, which I argue is a good default, right, and you don't like what you see, right, then the question is, well, what would you like to see, right? What 60-year-old self would you like? And um, when you've done that, um, when you've done that, I started losing my train of thought. I think that is what helps you make the change, is because then you have an idea of who you need to be to get to that point, right? And there's this difference between who you are now and who you need to be, and you can make that an actionable step. Okay, well, I'm going to grow this skill next. I'm going to grow that skill next. I'm going to network with these people. I'm going to pursue that career path. I'm going to go to more education. I'm going to do night classes or whatever the case might be. But you get clearer action steps when you have, I guess, when you look at your ambitions as opposed to um, your your predictions,
Right.
right?
Do you think there's a lot of merit in like pursuing what? Because like obviously like there's so much information you don't know what's
Right.
true and what's not. But like what intuitively feels right? Do you recommend like pursuing those ambitions and then once you achieve them or get close to achieving them, then you realize maybe they're not what you want. You can pivot from there.
Well, intuition is nice in that it's qualitative. It's similar to our emotional reaction to things, right? It's it can be pretty telling as a result. And so, I guess where I'm going with that is, I think it's great to listen to your intuition, but not trust it by default, right? So listen to it, write down what your intuition is saying, and then scrutinize it. Is pursuing that also practical? If it is also practical, go for it, right? If it's not practical, well, what version of it is practical? Because it's where sort of those two meet of what you want and what's practical that is going to give you your best actual outcome, right? And the goal is to get actual outcomes, not um, not a uh, not have these pie in the sky dreams and that aren't really achievable. If that makes sense. Nor is it virtue, or what's the word? Nor is it such a great idea to ignore your intuition altogether and just go for what's practical, because that's what a lot of people do and that's what drives a lot of regret, right? So it's finding the most practical version of what your intuition says to do and then doing it.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then one last question. Sure.
Yeah.
How do you go about like personally planning your day? It's like I've been like in terms of like breaking it down into blocks of like what we want to.
Right. So a couple things to save time. First of all, look at your repetitive behaviors, right? Things that you need to do on a regular, daily, weekly, monthly basis. Put that in with recurrence, right? That fills up often 60 to 70% of your time. And then what you're really doing on a regular basis, whether it's weekly or daily to different degrees, is you're evaluating what to do with the 30%, right? Um, and so in cases like that, I mean, different people have spoken to it. Covey in particular, right? What's important versus what's urgent, right? And not to mistake the two, right? Sometimes things are urgent and important, but it's really the importance that is the reason why you're doing them in the first place. And another way to look at that is, okay, a week from now, a month from now, or a year from now, uh, what will my next year's self be happy I did this week or today? If they don't really care that you did X, and they would have preferred Y, well, X is probably a waste of your time. As urgent as it is, or as important as somebody else in your life tells you it is to them, it doesn't mean it's important to you. And so, yeah, think about, is your future self going to pat you on the back for doing that? If not, it's a distraction.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Cool.
Thanks
Yeah,
again.
I hope that was helpful.
It was.
Thanks.